Imagine living in a town with friendly neighborhoods, great schools, a swimming pool, and perfectly trimmed lawns only for everyone to leave and the lights to stay on anyway. Canada is full of places like that. Not ruins from some distant medieval past, not half-imagined legends buried in folklore, but real communities where people raised children, built schools, opened shops, paid mortgages, and believed they had a future. Then the mine shut down, or the fish disappeared, or the government decided the place was too expensive to keep alive. And in some cases, that was it. An entire town could go from hopeful to finished in a matter of months. That is the part people do not like to talk about. Ghost towns sound enticing from a distance. They make for great road trips, eerie photographs, and dramatic drone shots. But most of them are not mysteries. They are warnings. They show what happens when a place depends on one employer, one industry, one rail line, one mill, one government promise, or one commodity price staying high forever. Because forever usually ends early. So today we are going through 10 ghost towns in Canada. Some are nearly erased, some are strangely preserved, some are still technically alive, which in a way makes them even sadder. And by the end of this list, you might start looking at any small resource town in this country a little differently. We are starting in Alberta, inside a national park, which is already not where you expect to find an industrial ghost town. Number 10 is Bankhead, Alberta. At the beginning of the 20th century, Bankhead was supposed to be useful. That was its entire reason for existing. In 1903, the Canadian Pacific Railway developed a coal mine near the base of Cascade Mountain, not far from Banff, and a town quickly formed around it. At its height, roughly 1,500 people lived there, and for a place built around a mine, it was surprisingly advanced. It had running water, sewer service, electricity, and streetlights at a time when many nearby communities were still catching up to that level of infrastructure. On paper, it should have worked. Hundreds of miners were pulling enormous quantities of coal out of the ground every year. The tunnels stretched for miles. The machinery was there. The labor was there. The town was there. The problem was that the coal itself was awful. It broke apart too easily. By the time it was processed and transported, a huge amount of it had turned into dust. So even though Bankhead looked productive, it was built on a resource that was barely worth the effort of extracting. That kind of flaw can hide for a while. Then suddenly, it cannot. Labor disputes in the 1920s added pressure to an operation that was already struggling, and in 1922, the mine shut down. Since this was a company town, that decision was basically a death sentence. The employer did not just provide jobs, it controlled the buildings, the services, and the reason for being there in the first place. Once the mine closed, residents had very little to hold on to. Within a few years, structures were being moved out of town and relocated elsewhere. Then came the final blow. In 1930, federal law banned future mining in Banff National Park, which meant Bankhead was not just dead, it was forbidden from reviving. That is what makes it memorable. Some ghost towns fail because of bad luck. Bankhead failed because its central resource was weak, its labor situation was unstable, and then the law sealed the grave. Today, you can still walk through the remains on a short trail with interpretive signs and mountain scenery so beautiful it feels almost rude. Nature has a way of making human collapse look calm. Number 9 is Grosse Île, Quebec. This one barely fits the usual idea of a ghost town because it is not really a town at all. It is an island. But if we are talking about abandoned places in Canada where history still feels physically present, it belongs on this list. Grosse Île sits in the St. Lawrence River downstream from Quebec City. In 1832, it was established as a quarantine station for immigrants arriving in British North America. Over the next century, millions of people passed through it. For many, it was simply a checkpoint. For thousands of others, it became the final place they would ever see. The catastrophe came in 1847 during the Irish potato famine. Desperate refugees crossed the Atlantic in overcrowded, disease-ridden ships that became known, for obvious reasons, as coffin ships. Typhus spread rapidly. Malnutrition weakened already vulnerable passengers. By the time vessels reached Canada, many aboard were desperately ill and many more were dead. Grosse Île was overwhelmed. The system in place had no chance of handling that volume of suffering. Ship after ship arrived. The sick kept coming. The medical staff lacked the beds, the supplies, and the capacity to respond to what was unfolding. Mass burials followed. In that single year alone, thousands were interred there, many in graves dug quickly because there was no time for anything else. This is what separates Grosse Île from the more cinematic kind of ghost town. There is no boom and bust industrial irony here, no clever tourist hook, no quirky afterlife as a movie set. It is heavy in a way that resists packaging. The island stands as a reminder that Canadian history is not only railways, expansion, and settlement brochures. It is also quarantine lines, public health failure, and people fleeing one disaster only to meet another. Today, the site is preserved, but preservation does not make it lighter. If anything, it sharpens the reality of what happened. The graves are still there. The memory is still there. And in a country that often edits discomfort out of its national story, Grosse Île remains stubbornly unedited. Number 8 is Rowley, Alberta. Now we go from tragedy to something stranger. Rowley is one of those places that almost refuses to die properly. Founded in 1912 as a prairie service town, it once supported the farms and ranches of the surrounding region. At its peak, around 500 people lived there. Then came the familiar pattern. Rail service declined, the economy weakened, drought and depression hit the prairies hard, and the population drained away. By the late 20th century, Rowley should have become one more fading dot on the map. Instead, the people who remained made a peculiar decision. If the town was going to look abandoned, they might as well lean into it. So they preserved the buildings, staged the streets, and effectively turned the place into a usable period setting for film crews. That is why Rowley has this weird second life. It is part ghost town, part museum, part film set, and part act of stubborn prairie humor. Old storefronts still stand, churches still rise above the flat landscape, interiors have been kept intact enough to create the illusion that the clock simply stopped a century ago. Productions have used it, visitors photograph it, and the handful of residents who remain have, in a sense, transformed decline into identity. What makes Rowley interesting is the philosophical mess of it. Is a ghost town still a ghost town if the survivors curate the haunting? If mannequins are positioned inside buildings and the place knowingly presents itself as an artifact, are you seeing history or performance? The answer is probably both. But that tension is part of the appeal. Rowley does not pretend it was untouched by time, it knows exactly what happened to it. It just decided that if it could not remain economically important, it could at least remain memorable. There is something admirably defiant in that. Plenty of towns disappear quietly. Rowley turned its own decline into a set piece and somehow made that work. Number 7 is Uranium City, Saskatchewan. This one is not quaint, it is not charming. It is not the kind of place where abandonment looks romantic in golden hour light. Uranium City feels like a warning issued over a loudspeaker that nobody wanted to hear. As the name suggests, the town existed because of uranium. During the Cold War, that mattered enormously. In the 1950s and 1960s, uranium was not just another mineral. It was tied to military strategy, nuclear energy, and national ambition. Canada wanted in, industry wanted in, governments wanted in. And so Uranium City was developed as a modern northern mining center built around that future. By the late 20th century, thousands of people lived in the wider area, with the town itself serving as the hub. Homes were built, schools opened, infrastructure expanded. There was confidence in the air because confidence is what boom towns run on. They are always built as if the boom is a law of nature. Then came the collapse. In 1981, the main mining operation announced it would shut down. For residents, the news landed with astonishing speed. Jobs vanished. Property values imploded. People who had invested their lives in the town discovered almost instantly that what they owned no longer had much market value. Families left in waves. Within months, the exodus was underway. By the early 1980s, the population had fallen off a cliff, and yet Uranium City did not become completely empty. That might have made the story simpler. Instead, a small population remained, which gives the place an even harsher emotional edge. It is not a cleanly abandoned ruin, it is a community trapped in extended contraction. The school corridors are empty, the infrastructure is stressed, the buildings deteriorate, but for the people still there, it is still home. That is what makes it hard to dismiss as just another failed mining town. Uranium City is what happens when a place is built quickly for a strategic purpose and then discarded once that purpose weakens. The town helped serve a national project bigger than itself. When the economics changed, the people were left to absorb the fallout. The map still shows the name, a few residents still hold on. But the dream that built it is long gone. Number 6 is Sandon, British Columbia. If you wanted to design a ghost town in a laboratory for maximum atmosphere, you would probably end up with something close to Sandon. It sits in a mountain valley in southeastern British Columbia and was once one of the great silver boom communities of the 1890s. At its height, thousands of people lived there. Hotels, saloons, shops, investment, optimism, all of it poured in because silver had made the place suddenly important. And like so many towns built on extraction, Sandon rose fast because speed was part of the business model. Nobody waits patiently during a mining rush. Capital surges in. Buildings go up. People assume permanence long before permanence has been earned. The decline began when silver prices fell and mining became less viable. That alone would have been enough to wound the town, but Sandon also had geography working against it. Mountain towns are dramatic when times are good and punishing when they are not. Flooding later damaged much of what remained, and the settlement never really recovered. Then the place acquired one of the strangest postscripts in Canadian ghost town history. Decades later, old trolley buses from Vancouver were brought there with the intention of preserving them. That restoration dream never fully materialized, so now Sandon contains layer upon layer of abandonment. 19th century mining relics, 20th century flood damage, mid-century transit vehicles rusting in rows. It is like 3 different failures parked in one valley. The result is deeply surreal. You can drive in and see leaning wooden buildings, bits of mining infrastructure, and those buses sitting there as if they took a wrong turn into another era and never found the road back out. Sandon does not feel staged. It feels unresolved. Nothing about it appears polished into heritage attraction form. It is simply there decaying in public. That rawness gives it power. A lot of preserved historic sites are tidy. Sandon is not tidy. It still looks like time is actively working on it, board by board, window by window, until the mountain weather eventually finishes the job. Number 5 is Val-Jalbert, Quebec. Val-Jalbert is one of the best preserved ghost towns in the country, which means it is also one of the most unsettling. Ruins are easier for people to romanticize when they are messy. A place that remains neat enough to enter, photograph, and even sleep in creates a different kind of discomfort. The town was founded in the early 1900s around a pulp mill built beside a dramatic waterfall. The location was chosen for industrial reasons, but it ended up looking theatrical. Water power drove the mill, houses rose nearby, streets formed, shops and public buildings appeared. For a while, Val-Jalbert was considered modern and desirable. Workers had amenities that many rural communities still lacked. It looked like one of those early 20th century company towns that promised progress in exchange for dependence, and dependence is the key word. When the market for the mill's output weakened, the whole thing became vulnerable. The operation closed in the 1920s, and once again, the basic company town problem revealed itself. If one employer creates nearly the entire local economy, the town does not really have a second act prepared. It has one script. When that script ends, everyone has to improvise. People left quickly. Buildings were boarded up. Silence moved in. But unlike so many places on this list, Val-Jalbert was later preserved rather than left to collapse completely. It eventually became a heritage destination. Visitors can walk the old streets, see the houses, and experience a version of the place that has been stabilized just enough to be consumed. That is where the unease comes from. Val-Jalbert is visually extraordinary. It may also be one of the clearest examples of how easily tragedy becomes tourism once enough time passes. Families once cried there because their livelihoods had vanished. Now visitors arrive for the atmosphere, the waterfall, and the novelty of spending a night in a restored ghost town setting. None of that makes the preservation wrong. In fact, without preservation, much of the place would be gone. But Val-Jalbert forces an uncomfortable question. When we save abandoned communities as heritage experiences, what exactly are we preserving? The architecture, the memory, or a cleaned-up version of loss that is easier to sell? Number 4 is Great Paradise and Ireland's Eye, Newfoundland and Labrador. I am putting these together because separating them would actually make the story harder to understand. These are not just abandoned settlements. They are pieces of a much larger policy-driven disappearance. In the mid-20th century, Newfoundland underwent widespread resettlement. Governments decided that many small outport communities were too costly and impractical to maintain. Services were expensive. Transportation links were weak. Economic planners believed that concentrating people into larger centers would create efficiency and opportunity. On paper, it sounded rational. On the ground, it meant dismantling places where families had lived for generations. Great Paradise had roots stretching back to the 18th century. Ireland's Eye also belonged to that older outport world of fishing families, kinship networks, and communities tied to coastal geography. These were not temporary camps that had simply outlived their use. They were deeply inhabited places with memory layered into every house site, footpath, and shoreline. Resettlement payments were offered, but the system came with pressure built into it. Communities often needed a very high level of agreement before the process moved forward. That meant neighbors were effectively voting on one another's futures. If enough people chose to leave, staying became nearly impossible. If enough people wanted to stay, others could be trapped. It was social, economic, and emotional coercion wrapped in bureaucracy. And then came the departures. Families moved houses when they could. Some structures were floated across the water rather than abandoned in place. Others were left behind. Churches stood for a time as lonely markers of what had been there. The government even removed some resettled communities from official maps, which is one of those details that sounds almost too symbolic to be real. It was not enough to empty the towns. They also had to be edited out. That is why these places matter so much in any discussion of Canadian ghost towns. Most abandoned towns are framed as unavoidable outcomes of markets or geography. Great Paradise and Ireland's Eye remind us that sometimes communities vanish because policy decides they should. People were not merely outcompeted by economics. They were reorganized out of existence. Today, these former outports are often described as hauntingly beautiful, which they are. But beauty can be misleading. Scenic abandonment still carries the weight of what was taken apart to make that view possible. Number 3 is Ocean Falls, British Columbia. Ocean Falls sounds like somewhere you invent for a novel about rain and industrial decline. It is remote, drenched, and so tied to its environment that the same water which once made it prosperous now helps destroy what remains. The town developed around a pulp and paper operation in the early 20th century. The location was difficult, but it offered something companies wanted badly: power and water. The nearby falls could generate hydroelectricity, and the local water supply was ideal for making high-quality paper. Those advantages were strong enough to justify building a substantial community in a place reachable mainly by boat or float plane. For decades, it worked. Ocean Falls had housing, services, schools, and the sense of shared isolation that often binds remote towns together. It also had rain, an astonishing amount of rain. Residents became used to a climate that would feel almost aggressive to outsiders. But as long as the mill functioned, the hardship seemed worth it. Then the economics shifted, ownership changed, the mill closed. Governments tried to keep things going for a while, but not indefinitely. Once the main employer failed, the population collapsed. Buildings that had depended on constant use and maintenance began losing their fight with the climate. In a place that wet, abandonment is not passive. Rain does not politely wait. It enters roofs, walls, foundations, and everything else. That is part of what makes Ocean Falls so memorable. It is not just a dead company town. It is a dead company town being actively dismantled by the weather that originally made it useful. The logic of its creation and the logic of its destruction come from the same source. And still, a few residents remain. The hydro infrastructure still matters. Even new uses have appeared around the old power supply. So again, this is not total extinction. It is an afterlife. A reduced, altered, improbable continuation in a place most of the country has forgotten. Number 2 is Anyox, British Columbia. If Canada has ghost towns, Anyox is one of the places that deserves the word epic. It was once one of the largest communities in British Columbia, built around a copper mine and smelter on the remote coast. At its peak, thousands lived there. This was not a tiny camp. It was a fully developed industrial settlement with serious infrastructure and serious ambition. Anyox had social life, sports, institutions, and the trappings of a place expected to endure. But it also had something else: pollution on a staggering scale. Smelting operations filled the air with fumes so harsh that daily life had to bend around them. Accounts from the era describe soot, contamination, and environmental damage so severe that the place almost sounds fictional. This was prosperity with a chemical aftertaste. The mine produced enormous wealth, but like every town on this list, it existed for one dominant purpose. When copper prices fell during the Depression, that purpose weakened. Stockpiles grew, buyers vanished, economics stopped making sense. In 1935, the operation closed, and with it, the community's future. What happened afterward made the place even more final. Fires later destroyed the wooden structures, and wartime salvage stripped away valuable metal. What remains now is skeletal, concrete, steel, scars on the landscape. Even reaching the site is difficult, which adds to the sense that Anyox belongs to another layer of Canadian history that most people never encounter directly. That remoteness almost protects its reputation. If Anyox were easy to reach, it would probably be far more famous because the scale of it is extraordinary. It was huge, productive, polluted, and then almost completely erased. Not because it never mattered, but because it mattered intensely for a while, and then stopped mattering to the forces that had created it. And that brings us to number 1, Kitsault, British Columbia. Kitsault may be the most absurd ghost town in Canada because it was not built slowly. It was assembled almost instantly, as if someone tried to speed run the creation of a community. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a company spent a fortune building a complete modern town in the remote north to serve a molybdenum mine. Houses, apartment blocks, a mall, recreation facilities, medical space, schools. All of it appeared in short order. Families moved in. Children enrolled. People unpacked their lives. And then, almost immediately, the economics collapsed. Commodity prices fell. The mine shut down. Residents were told to leave. Imagine the emotional whiplash of that. 1 minute, you are moving into a place designed to feel permanent. The next, you are discovering that its lifespan may be measured in months rather than decades. Kitsault was not abandoned after generations of slow decline. It was barely born before it was evacuated. That alone would make it unforgettable. But Kitsault has an even stranger second act. Instead of decaying into a typical ruin, it was later purchased and maintained. Roads were kept up, lawns were cut, Buildings were preserved. Utilities and facilities were looked after. The town sat empty but orderly, as if awaiting residents delayed by a weather system that never clears. This is the image that lingers. An immaculate town with almost no one in it. A place where the infrastructure of ordinary life remains in position, but the life itself never returned. It is ghostly not because it is wrecked, but because it is intact. That may be even creepier. Ruins at least admit what happened. Kitsault looks like denial made physical, and maybe that is why it takes the top spot. It compresses nearly every theme in this video into one place. Corporate optimism, resource dependence, shocking speed of collapse, and the stubborn refusal to accept that a community can simply end. The lights stay on. Maintenance continues. Hope lingers long after logic has left the room. That is what ghost towns reveal better than almost anything else. Communities do not vanish only because the buildings fail. They vanish because the story people were told about why the place existed turns out to be temporary. Sometimes that realization takes decades. Sometimes it takes a single radio announcement. Sometimes it takes one market crash. Sometimes it takes a government program with a polite name and brutal consequences. And Canada has never really stopped producing places like this. That is the uncomfortable part. It is easy to treat ghost towns as completed history, something safely sealed behind museum plaques and drone footage. But the same ingredients are still here. Single industry dependence is still here. Remote communities waiting on outside capital are still here. Political decisions about which places are worth servicing are still here. Boom and bust resource logic is still here. Every one of these towns was once ordinary to the people living in it. That is what makes them powerful. They were not symbols yet. They were just home. There were groceries to buy, kids to pick up, roofs to repair, neighbors to greet, bills to pay. Then one day, often faster than anyone expected, the future narrowed. The reasons to stay disappeared, and the places joined a long Canadian archive of abandonment. So, when people talk about ghost towns like they're just spooky roadside attractions, it misses the point completely. These are not simply empty places, they are records of broken assumptions. They show how quickly a functioning community can become a memory if it depends on conditions it cannot control. If you find these stories interesting, subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments below if there are any Canadian towns you think I've missed.